It was early morning when Alexander Grant arrived at the private hangar, his mind already preoccupied with the high-stakes business meeting awaiting him in Geneva. As he approached the sleek silver jet, a wave of anticipation surged through him. Another trip, another deal to close. But today felt different, though he couldn't yet pinpoint why. His private jet, which he had named the Phoenix for its rebirth from humble beginnings, gleamed under the rising sun. The pilot and crew were already inside, preparing for takeoff. Alexander checked his watch. Time to board. But as his polished leather shoes clicked against the tarmac, a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, made him stop in his tracks. At first, he dismissed it as the usual hum of the engines being prepped. But then it came again, a rustling sound followed by a soft, muffled thud. His sharp business instincts kicked in, and without thinking, he motioned to a security detail, signaling them to investigate. The security team approached the rear of the jet, near the cargo hold. Alexander's irritation flared. Whoever was tampering with his property would be dealt with swiftly. But as his team opened the door to the cargo hold, his irritation turned to confusion. A small, scruffy figure stood in the shadows, clutching a backpack that looked too large for her small frame. Her face was obscured by a mass of tangled hair, but when she stepped into the light, Alexander could see the fear in her eyes. She was a child no older than 9, maybe 10. "Who are you?" Alexander demanded, his voice sharp with authority. The girl flinched at the sound of his voice, her wide brown eyes locking onto his. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. After a long moment of silence, she whispered, "Layla? Layla, huh?" Alexander raised an eyebrow, a mix of confusion and frustration bubbling within him. "How did you get in here?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at the floor as if searching for the right words. I didn't have anywhere else to go," she mumbled. "I'm all alone." The word struck him, and for a brief second, the tension in the air lifted. His anger gave way to something unfamiliar, a kind of vulnerability that made him take a step closer. "What happened to your parents?" Layla's eyes welled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, her hands trembling. "They died in a car crash. I've been on my own ever since." The words were like a punch to his gut. Alexander's mind raced. He had always been taught that success came from hard work, from outsmarting others, from making deals that no one else would. But here was a little girl, alone in the world, hiding in his jet in the hopes that it would take her somewhere safe. He didn't know why he did it, but before he could stop himself, he turned to his security team and said, "She's coming with me." The staff exchanged uncertain glances, but they knew better than to question his decisions. They simply nodded and began to prepare for the flight. As the jet's engines roared to life and they began to ascend into the sky, Alexander sat in the plush seat across from Layla, who now looked less like a frightened child and more like someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly. She had changed into a clean, comfortable outfit that Alexander's team had arranged, but her eyes still carried the weight of someone who had seen far too much for her age. For the first time in a long while, Alexander found himself questioning everything: the luxury, the power, the deals that had brought him to this point. None of it seemed as important as it had moments before. In the quiet of the jet, as the world below shrank away, Alexander Grant found himself face to face with something that could no longer be ignored: the truth of the world he had built, and the realization that he had the power to change it. Layla, on the other hand, was unsure of what to think. She had gone from a homeless orphan to a passenger on a private jet in the span of an hour. She watched the world outside the window, still processing the strange turn her life had just taken. What would come next? She didn't know, but for the first time, she felt a spark of hope, something she hadn't felt in over a year. As the jet sailed smoothly through the clouds, Alexander sat in silence, staring out the window, the weight of the girl's words echoing in his mind. "I have nothing," and yet she had somehow found a way to survive. What had he truly done with everything he had? This was only the beginning of a journey neither of them could have anticipated. The hours passed slowly as the jet glided through the sky, and the contrast between Alexander's usual business trips and this one was palpable. The hum of the engines filled the otherwise silent cabin. Layla had curled up in the plush seat opposite him, her eyes wide with curiosity as she looked around the luxurious interior. Alexander tried to focus on the documents he had spread out in front of him, but the words on the pages blurred as his mind kept drifting back to the small girl in the corner of the jet. He couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that had taken root deep in his chest, the sensation of doing something that didn't fit the usual patterns of his life. Layla was silent for the most part, but Alexander could see her eyes darting around, trying to absorb the world she had suddenly been thrust into. She seemed mesmerized by the intricate details of the jet's interior, from the polished wood paneling to the rich leather seats. The child had no concept of luxury, at least not this kind of luxury. Finally, she spoke, her voice small but filled with genuine wonder. "Is this your jet?" Alexander glanced up from his papers, meeting her wide eyes. "Yes," he said, his tone softer than he intended. "It's part of my company. It's so big." Layla's eyes roamed the interior, her expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Is this where you live?" He smiled faintly, but there was something about the innocence in her question that made him uncomfortable. "No, it's just a means of travel. I have a home in New York." Layla nodded, though she didn't seem convinced. She had been homeless for so long that the idea of a luxurious home was beyond her comprehension. Her life had been confined to alleyways and the occasional shelter, places where comfort was a luxury and survival was the only goal. Layla's gaze shifted to the window, where the city below had begun to fade, replaced by a sea of clouds. She sighed, a sound that carried the weight of a year's worth of sorrow and struggle. Alexander noticed this and felt a pang of guilt. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting his papers aside. Layla didn't answer immediately. She simply stared at the sky, her face drawn with exhaustion. Finally, she turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never been on a plane before. I don't even know where we're going. What happens to me now?" Alexander paused, unsure how to answer. The truth was, he had no real plan. His only impulse had been to get her away from the hangar, away from the unknown danger that might have awaited her. But what did he expect after that? I don't know," he admitted, the rare honesty in his voice surprising him. "I wasn't planning on taking anyone with me. But you're safe now, at least for the moment. We'll figure something out." Layla's gaze lingered on him for a moment, as if measuring the sincerity of his words. Then she nodded and sat back in her seat. She didn't speak again, but her small body seemed to relax just slightly, as though the uncertainty of her life had momentarily softened. The next few hours passed in a haze. Alexander thought about his meeting in Geneva, about the company's quarterly projections, the negotiations he would have to lead, the money at stake, but it all seemed distant now. His usual ambitions, his usual goals, felt shallow compared to the raw reality of the situation before him. Layla was an orphan, alone in the world, and somehow she had made it this far. She had hidden in his jet, hoping for escape, for a chance to survive. How many others like her were out there, struggling in silence? As the jet neared its destination, Alexander's thoughts drifted back to the many people he had encountered throughout his life, the people he had helped to build his empire, the ones he had left behind, the ones who had been nothing more than numbers in his business ledger. But now, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was someone who could make a difference, or at least he should be. He looked at Layla once more, watching her gently fall asleep in the corner of the jet, her backpack resting beside her. She had no idea what her future held, and Alexander realized that he might be the only one who could offer her something better than what she had known. When the jet touched down in Geneva, the quiet hum of the engines winding down, Alexander knew that this trip would be like no other. As he stood and stretched, preparing for his meetings, he made a silent vow to himself. Layla would not be left behind. Not like this. The next morning, Orydale was alive with speculation. Some believed Jorah would leave soon, realizing no human would ever agree to her proposal. Others thought she might become a permanent fixture, her ship a constant reminder of an invitation no one was brave enough to accept. Orphan, however, had no time for gossip. He spent the early hours in his workshop, trying to steady his thoughts as he worked on a small invention, an audio translator he had tinkered with for months. It wasn't perfect, but it had served him well in learning about alien languages from intercepted signals. Now, it might be the key to bridging the gap between him and Jorah. He slipped the device into his coat pocket, took a deep breath, and made his way toward the clearing where Jorah's ship rested. The ship gleamed under the midday sun, its surface reflecting the surrounding trees like a surreal mirror. As Orphan approached, he felt a strange mix of excitement and trepidation. When he reached the base of the ramp, the same low hum from the previous night vibrated through the air. A moment later, Jorah appeared at the top, her towering frame framed by the gleaming entryway. "You have returned," she said, her golden eyes locking onto Orphan. "I wanted to talk," Orphan replied, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. He adjusted the translator device in his pocket, though it seemed Jorah's grasp of his language was impeccable. Jorah stepped down the ramp, her luminous patterns flickering softly. "Few have the courage to approach me a second time. What is it you seek, human?" Orphan hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't know if I seek anything," he admitted, "but I do know that your words last night, about connection, about learning, resonated with me." Her glowing patterns pulsed faintly, a sign of her interest. "Then you are unlike the others. Most see only my appearance and recoil." Orphan chuckled nervously. "Well, you are a bit intimidating." A low, melodic hum escaped Jorah, almost like a laugh. "Intimidation was never my intention. I come with an open heart, though I see how difficult it is for your kind to look past my form." Orphan took a deep breath and stepped closer. "It's not just your form. It's what you're asking. Marriage isn't something humans take lightly. It's a bond of trust and love. And most of us aren't used to the idea of forming that kind of bond with someone so different." Jorah tilted her head, her golden eyes narrowing slightly as she considered his words. "Then tell me, Orphan, is it impossible for a human to love one such as me?" The question hung in the air, heavy and profound. Orphan felt the weight of it pressing on his chest. "I don't think it's impossible," he said finally, his voice soft but firm. "But it would take time. Trust doesn't happen overnight." Jorah's luminous patterns flared briefly, a sign of her emotions. "Time I am willing to give, but I cannot deny that I hoped for a human with the courage to try, to take the first step toward what could be." Orphan looked up at her, his heart pounding. He felt a strange pull toward her, not just because of her beauty, which was otherworldly and awe-inspiring, but because of the vulnerability in her words. "What if," he began, his voice faltering for a moment, "what if I took that step, not as a promise, but as a start?" Jorah's patterns glowed brightly, her golden eyes widening slightly. "You would consider such a bond?" Orphan nodded, though his palms were slick with sweat. "I don't know where this will lead, but I think you deserve someone who's willing to try. And maybe I'm that person." Jorah stepped closer, her towering presence making Orphan feel both small and oddly safe. She extended a hand, her long, silver fingers glowing faintly. "Then let us begin. Not with promises, but with understanding." Orphan hesitated only briefly before placing his hand in hers. Her touch was warm, her skin smooth yet alive with an energy that sent a gentle tingling sensation up his arm. "I must warn you," Jorah said, her voice softer now. "Such a journey will not be without challenges. My people will question this. Your people will fear it. But if you are willing to face these obstacles with me, I will give all of myself to this bond." Orphan met her gaze, his resolve hardening. "I don't know if I'm ready for all of that, but I'm willing to try." Jorah's glowing patterns shifted into a steady, harmonious rhythm, a visual representation of her gratitude. Then you are braver than most of your kind, Orphan. Let us see where this path takes us. As the sun began to set over Orrydale, Orphan walked back to town, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of excitement, fear, and determination. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. His life had changed forever. Back at the ship, Jorah watched him go, her glowing patterns pulsing with hope. For the first time since her arrival, she felt a glimmer of possibility, of connection. Months passed since that moment in Geneva, and Alexander Grant had become a different man. The whirlwind of business trips, deals, and boardroom strategies hadn't ceased, but something had shifted within him. His focus had expanded, no longer confined to just increasing profits, expanding market shares, or personal wealth. His work had begun to intertwine with his new purpose, changing the lives of children like Layla. Layla had blossomed under Alexander's care. She was no longer the scared, uncertain child who had hidden in the cargo hold of his jet. She was curious, confident, and determined to make a difference, much like her adoptive father. Alexander had enrolled her in a prestigious school where she excelled. He made sure that she had the emotional support and the resources she needed to thrive. But beyond the comforts of her new life, Layla had found a new calling. She began to speak at charity events, sharing her story of survival and hope. The same quiet courage that had once led her to sneak aboard Alexander's jet now fueled her advocacy for orphans and underprivileged children around the world. She became the face of the foundation that Alexander had launched in her name, the Layla Grant Foundation, dedicated to providing education, shelter, and a better future for children who had been abandoned by society. At first, Alexander had focused on large-scale projects, building schools, creating shelters, and partnering with governments. But over time, he realized that true change wasn't just about providing resources. It was about creating a system of support, one where children like Layla could not only survive but thrive. And it wasn't just about giving them a chance. It was about ensuring they had the tools to make their own choices, to shape their futures. One day, as Alexander sat at his desk, reviewing the Foundation's latest reports, Layla came into his office. She had been busy working on a new initiative to help foster children transition into adulthood with mentorship and job training. She was growing into a young woman, confident in her voice and her ability to lead. "Dad," she said, smiling, "I've been thinking. We need to do more than just provide for them. We need to give them a way to believe in themselves, to see the possibilities in their lives." Alexander looked up at her, his heart swelling with pride. "That's exactly what we've been working toward. You're already changing the world, Layla. You're showing them that there's more than just surviving. There's living." Layla nodded thoughtfully. "I used to wonder what my life would be like if someone had cared about me sooner. But now, I'm not just wondering. I'm doing something about it." Her words resonated deeply within him. This was the future he had dreamed of when he took her in that day on the jet. He had wanted to give her a life beyond the streets, but she had transformed that gift into something much greater, a movement, a legacy, one that would outlast them both. A few weeks later, at the grand opening of a new orphanage and learning center in the heart of New York, Alexander stood beside Layla as she addressed a crowd of donors, politicians, and supporters. She spoke with the same raw sincerity she had shown when she first asked him what would happen to her. But now, her voice carried the weight of hope, of change, and of a future that was in her hands. "Today," Layla said, her voice steady and strong, "we are making a promise to the children who feel like they have nowhere to go, like the world has forgotten them. We are giving them not just a roof over their heads, but a future filled with possibilities." The crowd erupted into applause, but Alexander wasn't looking at the audience. He was looking at Layla, the young girl who had once been lost, hidden away in the shadows, now standing tall as a beacon of hope for thousands of children. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment, a sense that his wealth, his success, had found its true purpose. And it wasn't in the boardrooms or the bank accounts. It was in the lives of children like Layla, who had been given not just a chance to survive, but the opportunity to change the world. Later that evening, after the event had ended and the lights of the city glittered outside, Alexander and Layla stood by the window in his office. "You know, I never imagined it would be like this," Alexander said quietly, gazing at the skyline. "I spent so much of my life building things that didn't really matter. But now, I feel like I'm building something that will last." Layla smiled and placed her hand on his arm. "You've always had the power to build, Dad. You just had to learn what truly mattered." Alexander looked down at her, a sense of peace settling over him. The world he had once built, one based on profit and success, had been remade into something much more meaningful. A world where everyone had the chance to succeed, where no child was left behind. And as he looked at the young girl who had changed his life, and through her, the lives of so many others, he knew that together they had built something truly extraordinary. Epilogue. Years later, Alexander and Layla stood side by side in the same hangar where they had first met, now transformed into a community center that offered education, mentorship, and hope to children in need. The jet that had once carried Alexander across the world was now a symbol of the journey they had undertaken together, a reminder of how an unexpected encounter had changed everything. Layla, now an adult, had become a powerful voice for children's rights around the world. She had used the resources Alexander had given her to create a network of foster care systems and educational programs that spanned across continents. The foundation had grown into one of the largest in the world, and together, they had created a global movement that reached millions. In that moment, as they looked out at the future they had built, Alexander realized that the true measure of success was not in wealth or power, but in the legacy of lives changed, the hearts touched, and the hope given to those who needed it most. And with Layla by his side, he knew their work was far from over. Together, they had found something more valuable than any treasure: a family, a mission, and a future full of endless possibilities.